So this is pretty interesting. This happens very often in animals, non-human animals, and in humans as well, right? The pigeons were being rewarded randomly, had nothing to do with their responses. But because perhaps the pigeon spins in a circle and then gets a reward, it thinks it needs to spin in a circle. So what ends up happening is you'll see pigeons just spinning around. That would be a superstitious behavior. Pretty neat. All right. Well, what is the purpose of conditioning? Why does this happen? Why does this happen? Well, it does make sense in nature, right? Generally, things in nature that are paired together are going to occur together. And it might prepare us for anticipated stimuli, right? And operant conditioning, too, is also important in nature. Changing our behavior in response to the consequences. That's pretty important. But we should remember that associative processes do not work all the time. They are not the be-all, end-all of our behavior. We are not completely controlled by classical conditioning or by operant conditioning. We're not completely controlled by the anticipatory nature of stimuli being paired together. We're not completely controlled by our responses to consequences, right? So it doesn't always work. Okay. So we're thinking of constraints on learning, and we're thinking of how it's adaptive. There are a couple terms here that are important. So equipotentiality means that all stimuli have the equal potential to become conditioned stimuli for all conditioned responses. But the associations between some stimuli are easier to learn than others due to their adaptive value. Okay, what does that mean? A good example of showing this is something known as the bright, noisy water experiment. Okay, so we have rats again. And in these two groups of rats, a bright light, a loud noise, and a sweet solution are all being paired together. So bright light, bright noise, kind of aversive, not very nice. But a sweet solution, very nice. Okay? So the rats in the two groups are getting the same stimulus. But then in one group, there's a group of rats that get a foot shock. And in the other group, they're exposed to illness, which is shown by this little rat throwing up, which is incorrect because rats don't vomit. So I don't know why that's drawn that way, but okay. Sick rat. Okay. Now what they're looking at is they want to see in these two groups of rats, what do they pick between regular water that's bright and noisy or a sweet solution? What do these two groups do? Do they take that regular meh water that's bright and noisy, or do they go drink the sweet solution? So what you're looking at here on the y-axis, laps per minute, that means how much they're drinking. Laps being laps with their tongue. And on the x-axis, you have the sickness or the shock group. The white bars are with the sweet tasting conditioned stimulus, and the gray are with the light sound conditioned stimulus. And the interesting thing that they found was those rats that got sick, they don't want to drink that sweet stimulus, they'd rather take the regular water. But it's reversed for the rats that got shocked. So still two unpleasant stimuli, right? But sickness was associated with the taste, right? Because when we eat things that make us feel ill, we pair those things together. And the physical stimulus, the shock, was associated with the light and the tone. Right? So some stimuli pair more clearly than others. And that can kind of lead us into taste aversion. So a conditioned taste aversion is an aversion to a particular food that is acquired after getting sick following consuming that food. You often hear this with alcohol. Someone has a really fun night with, let's say, some tequila. They get really sick the next day and they say, oh, I can't have tequila. It makes me sick every time I smell it. Conditioned taste aversion. Right? They might be fine with other types of alcohol, but that one type they cannot have. Right? In this scenario, the alcohol is causing the sickness, right? But it doesn't actually matter if the food itself caused the sickness. Just that the sickness occurred after consumption of the food. So monarch butterflies have a toxin, right? They are toxic to eat because they eat milkweed, right? And you can see this blue jay here eating a monarch butterfly and getting sick right after, right? And we see this in nature quite often, right? Especially in lots of insects, poisonous insects, poisonous to eat, right? And it can become very clear, oh, I ate that brightly colored thing, I feel sick, I shouldn't eat that anymore. Right? But it happens with us too. Never gonna eat it again, right? Makes you feel sick just thinking about it. Okay. Another important term, informativeness. If there's no information to be gained, then learning does not happen. Okay. So there are scenarios in which this association with stimuli isn't always going to be so strong. So there's some important terms to know in the context of this. So, okay, blocking is one. So let's say when you introduce a second conditioned stimulus after an association has already been formed, it adds little to no information, and there's very little conditioning. Okay. So let's say every time you come into class, I blow a whistle. That means there's a quiz. Obviously that wouldn't happen, but let's just say did that. Okay, so you learn whistle means quiz, right? But then I come in and start ringing a bell as well. I'm introducing a second conditioned stimulus after an association has been formed. You're not going to really respond to the bell the same way that you respond to the whistle. Very little conditioning with the bell. Latent inhibition is another one. So repeated exposure to a stimulus prior to conditioning results in reduced conditioning when it's eventually paired. So if I came in and just started ringing a bell every day, nothing happens. But then I start trying to pair the bell with a quiz, it's not going to work as well. That's latent inhibition. Temporal continuity basically just mean that when stimuli are paired closer together in time, they're more easily learned. That's why you come home and you see that your dog has destroyed, I don't know, something. You probably shouldn't punish them because you don't know when it happened. You should reward or punish behaviors close to when they happen. If it takes too long, probably not going to work so well. The one big exception to this is the taste aversion. That can happen hours later, and you'll still make that association. But stimuli are more easily paired when close together in time. There's also salience. A really loud sound is more salient than a quiet sound. A really delicious reward is better than an okay reward. If you love chocolate, but you don't like pizza, chocolate would be more salient than pizza. So if multiple conditioned stimuli predict a stimulus, the most noticeable one will be associated. So if I, again, let's go with the bell or the whistle. If I blew a really loud whistle and then a really quiet one with the test, you would pair the louder whistle more than the quiet whistle. So there's information, right? Important information. Okay, extinction. So if the US or the reinforcer is no longer present while learning, the response from the animal will gradually reduce. But an important distinction to make is that extinction is not actually forgetting. Okay. So here's a figure kind of showing that extinction is not forgetting. Okay, so let's say stop rewarding a behavior, right? Eventually, the response to that is going to lower, right? But it doesn't mean it's forgotten, because let's say you give a novel stimulus, the response might come right back up. So they didn't forget. After a new context, you might also see response renewal, time delay, you might see spontaneous recovery. So even if a behavior lowers in response rate, it becomes extinct, goes through extinction. It's not like the information is forgotten, because that response rate can go right back up. It's just that the information is no longer useful in this context, right? But not forgotten. Okay. Last little beat here. So what associations are formed in conditioning? Is it just simple associations between stimuli? Or are they more complicated mental representations? Just associating two things, or not? Okay. Simply saying that classical conditioning is a stimulus-stimulus association actually has pretty limited explanatory power. So there could be more complex processes at play in certain situations, right? That classical conditioning alone might not capture. So learning isn't just simple stimulus-stimulus association. We're not just associating stimuli together, and that's how we're learning. Or animals, too. When I say we, I generally mean animals. I'm including us as humans in there. Another important thing to note is that some conditioned stimuli will cause the same physiological response, and others will cause a different or opposite physiological response. So the conditioned response is not always going to be the same to the unconditioned response. So it can't just be a simple stimulus-stimulus association. If the US is devalued, that can also change the responses to the conditioned stimulus. So there's a dynamic interaction between stimuli and their value changes. And that challenges a simplistic view of just a stimulus-stimulus association or a stimulus-response association. So the important part I want to make here is that classical conditioning, stimulus-stimulus associations, important framework for understanding certain aspects of learning, but they do have limitations in capturing the complexity and variability of real-world learning experiences. So learning can't just be simple stimulus-stimulus association, but still an important framework to understand learning. Okay, so what associations are formed in operant conditioning? We have our response, our outcome, our stimulus. So is the association primarily between the stimulus and the response, or between the response and the outcome? This has been a debate in this area. And those who argue that it's more of a response outcome is that the devaluation of the outcome in the absence of the stimulus can change the response. Remember, devaluation meaning things become less valuable. But the important point to take away from here is that operant conditioning is concerned with how behaviors are strengthened or weakened based on the consequences that follow those behaviors. But the devaluation of the outcome in the absence of the stimulus shows the dynamic nature of operant learning. Okay, we're going to end on the Rescorla-Wagner model. So this is a mathematical model for classical conditioning. So you can mathematically model learning. Pretty important. So at lambda, we have the maximum amount of learning that can happen. And we can see that learning increases with each conditioned experience. The important thing to take away from this figure is that learning is actually greatest when we know the least. And as we know more, less learning happens with each conditioned experience. So you see there's actually a big increase, right, at the beginning, and then it kind of asymptotes out, right? So we might have an intuitive feeling of this. When we're first learning something, we're learning a lot. And then the more you learn, it feels like the less you're learning every time. Wow. There's actually a mathematical model for that. Okay. So this is a pretty important concept. And it seems scary because there's lots of math. So I found a pretty nice video that breaks down a lot of this stuff about the Rescorla-Wagner model and also breaks down quite a bit about classical conditioning. So it's about 15 minutes long, but very nice, and that's how we're going to end the class. So we're going to watch that video, and then we'll be good for this week.
Now, a quick note, this video is really tough without assuming a little bit of background knowledge. There may be a couple of things about classical conditioning that can probably use deeper discussion, but hopefully we'll be okay without getting too far off track. So let's start with a brief overview of classical conditioning. Remember Pavlov's dog?